All right, so welcome this evening. First, I'm going to introduce myself for anyone who's new. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator for Clay and Owen counties. I'm also an entomologist. I've been an entomologist for about 12 years now, and I've worked with a variety of species. And when I was doing my graduate research, I actually studied this particular guy right here, the fall armyworm. It has the scientific name Spodoptera frugiperta. They're really kind of a fascinating insect, and they're very, very easy to research. They're very resilient. You can do a lot of different kinds of experiments exploring how they feed and how they move and what they react to. So scientifically speaking, they're a great exemplar. However, when it comes down to what it's going to mean for our crops and our yards, they can be some pretty bad news. So I'm going to go into a little bit of the background information on this insect. So fall armyworm is a part of our group that contains our butterflies and moths. So that would make it a member of order Lepidoptera for those of you who are familiar with insect orders. This order contains all of our insects that are going to have scales on their wings, which are our butterflies and moths. If you actually see an adult version of this caterpillar, the actual moth, you probably won't think much of it. You'll probably think that it's just your usual plain brown and gray moth that you'll see flying around the light at night. Now, the good thing is that the adult moths cause no damage to plants. They actually do have a digestive tract, which is not true for all adult moths. These guys will feed on nectar on a variety of different plants. The caterpillars, however, are the major problem that we will see. The caterpillars are very active. They're very, very mobile at certain times of day. And like I said, they're fairly resilient. They have good behavioral strategies to survive and avoid predators. And they can be really difficult to find if they're in an actual agricultural situation where they're doing damage or if they're causing damage to turf grass. This pest has been well known for a very long time agriculturally and in turfgrass environments. But some years, like this year, you will see heavy infestations occur. While this isn't necessarily the normal thing we experience with our fall armyworm, this year really isn't that unusual. Heavy infestations have been known in the past, and they typically prefer drought conditions, and that's where they're going to really thrive. And this summer, we pretty much had exactly that. So seeing them in these numbers this year isn't really surprising to an entomologist. So just as a quick reminder, this is a moth, which means it has a life cycle that includes a complete metamorphosis, which means they are going to start from an egg that's been laid by an adult. That egg will hatch into a caterpillar that you can see there on the bottom of the circle. The caterpillar will eventually form a chrysalis or cocoon, and in there they're going to reconstruct their bodies into the adult form you see at the top. The other information you see at the bottom there, that's just something that I kind of thought was neat, and I left it on there from the researchers who originally put it together. What it's talking about there is the hormone that insects use to travel through the different stages of their development, ecdysteroid or disone. That's basically the hormone that they balance to try to move through each life cycle. So let's go over our adult moths a little bit here. So this is perhaps one of the best images I have ever seen of Spodoptera frugiperta as an adult, because all of the wing scales are still present, and that's really, really hard. Most of the time when you see these insects, half of the scales have worn off. There may be different color patterns. They may not stay very, very solid. So they're going to be the color patterns and different colors will kind of get blurry or they'll disappear altogether. And it can make identifying them just by the wings really, really challenging. These moths are a part of a family known as Noctuidae. This contains all of our owlet moths, cutworms, and all of the other armyworm species. I would normally say this is an extremely common group of moths, but the trouble is that entomologists who work as systematists have often moved these moths around different groups as we've grown to understand a little bit more of the genetics and the different body morphologies of these insects. It's a lot of that kind of highbrow science stuff as we try to figure out how to organize species, and it won't matter a whole lot to you, but I'd like to kind of bring you that guys this information so you can understand how we entomologists look at the different species that we work with. These are extremely cosmopolitan. They are all over the place. I was recently reading some scientific research on these moths being done in South Africa, but they're also extremely common in the United States as well. That being said, they are not actually native to this portion of the United States. They typically prefer the southern United States, more Texas area. They will not do very well in our environment in a few weeks coming, but we'll go into that a little more later. Now, like I said, the adults can be difficult to identify. However, there are a few features that we can use that I'm about to show you. Now, as moths and butterflies, this is one thing I always try to dispel. There's a little bit of myths around how they feed. They possess siphoning mouth parts. Basically, their mouth is shaped like a hose. It cannot pierce your skin. They are not blood feeders. They can't do damage to anything. They are quite literally some of the most harmless animals you'll ever see. All they do is they feed on nectar. They can't attack seeds. They can't attack plants. This is for the adults, mind you. The adults are extremely capable of flying long distances. They're more subject to wind than other insects. For example, a bee or a bumblebee is going to be a very, very steady, very capable flyer, or your normal housefly is an expert flyer. These guys our moths here are built for endurance. They will go very long distances and they will use the winds to help them do so, which means that even in the space of a night, they can spread very, very far, very, very quickly, which is why we're kind of in the situation we're in right now. And it's also how they migrate. Now, the ways that you're going to identify the adult moths, there are a couple of white spots you're going to see. I've highlighted 2 of them, but there are technically 4. So the 2 that I've highlighted there with the red circles are the white spots that are at the very tips of the wings. And those spots tend to be on all members of this species. They're very, very stable. They don't move around a whole lot. The other 2 white spots are about halfway up the wings, right in the middle, and they're kind of diamond shaped. These often will get mixed in or rubbed away with other colors in my personal experience, though I don't know what research exists that has shown any different morphologies. I'm just sharing with you what I have personally seen. You can reliably use those 2 white spots at the back of the wings. And what I also typically do is if you look at what we call the pronotum, basically the back of the insect, that just behind its head, that kind of area where you think it'd be shoulders and back, it looks a little bit hump shaped and it's kind of furry. That's another trait that I like to use, but it's also shared by other insects. So I use that in combination with the white spots on the wings to help me identify what moth I'm looking at right then. Now, the adults usually will locate each other through chemical communication. This is true for many, many moth and butterfly species. In the case of this species, it's definitely very true. What they're going to do is that one sex is going to release a pheromone, a chemical, that is intended to act as a messenger to the opposite sex to tell them, I'm here and I'm ready to mate. Females will tend to lay all of their eggs at one time, though I would like to see a little bit more research on that because I did see some conflicting things. But what it's going to matter to you is that there will be a lot of eggs laid at once. That is very reliable. You'll also see generations arise at the same time. Basically, all the females are laying eggs all at the same time, and all of their young are going to develop at the same rate. These moths are also widely distributed across states east of the Rockies, but like I said, they aren't really native here. They migrate here and they usually like to spend this time of year in this area, but they're not going to survive our winters. They are not resilient against cold conditions. If it gets any colder than this, they're going to die really quick. So let's go over the part that you're really concerned about, the caterpillars. And I can't say enough about how voracious these caterpillars are. They will consume, if it's within their preferred food group, they will consume stuff at a rate that is just mind-numbing if you have a heavy infestation. And I imagine a few of you are probably here because some of your yards have maybe taken damage from these insects. Or there are some garden plants. I just got a report today of a friend of mine seeing this in kale. You may, if you have a farm, you may have seen them in your alfalfa fields. This, I think within the last month and a half alone, I've had 6 different farmers who lost around 50 acres total, I think, of alfalfa to Spodoptera frugiperta, which can be a really hard hit to your budget, especially if that's something you rely on heavily. So the identification of these can be a little bit challenging if you're not familiar. However, when it comes to caterpillars, they're actually fairly easy, and I'm going to show you guys how you do that. So their color is going to range between greens and mottled browns, often with striping in various spots. And you may have heard of species like the striped armyworm or the true armyworm, and they're going to have different features that help identify them. But the thing that's going to be consistent with fall armyworm is going to be the inverted Y shape that's on their head capsule. And I'm going to show you that momentarily. You're also going to see on their very last abdominal segments 4 really obvious bumps that are raised. Now, these insects can get quite long, at least in comparison to other caterpillars, that is. They can grow to up to about 1.5 inches in length, and they can get big. And when they get to that size, they're really resilient. I mean, birds will pick them off if they can find them, but they can move, they can hide, and they can be challenging to find, even in areas where you know they have to be present. So let's take a look at some of these identifying features for these guys. So thanks to Dr. Obermeyer here, who's been a blessing to our entomology department for many years now with his work on insects just like this. You can see he's marked out the inverted Y shape on the head, and that is a very stable trait. I have never seen an example of these caterpillars without that shape. He's also pointing at 4 raised bumps on that last abdominal segment. And you can see them being pointed at by those red arrows on the right hand there. Now, in this picture, they're a little bit more mottled brown. I've seen them a little bit lighter colored than that, and also much darker colored, nearly black on these as well. The colors are going to vary by how long this larva has spent in this instar. So larvae, as they develop, are separated by instars, periods of time where they grow in between molting. So if it's been a longer period of time, if they're further into the instar they're currently occupying, then most likely their colors are going to be darker. Again, that's just from my personal experience having worked with these. I would want to see research before I can guarantee that one, but I think that's a very safe bet to make. All right, so their arrival. Now, like I've been saying, they can't survive Indiana's winter. I would arguably say that when we got so cold yesterday, that may have done some damage to their populations because that was awful cold for them to try to survive. What we're seeing when these guys arrive here is we're seeing infestation that occurs from migrants that are coming from Texas and nearby states from that area, where you have drier and more arid environments. Because in those areas, what they're going to do is they rely on cotton crops to act as their food source. And then some of them have a migratory behavior where they'll come up here and begin to consume grass species. When the adults arrive, they're going to lay their eggs, and then the larvae that hatch from those eggs are going to form the damaging portion of that life cycle in our area. They're then going to pupate, and we're going to have a second generation eventually of adults. So we usually have about 2 generations here in Indiana that will occur. Anything after that either needs to migrate back, or, which is more likely, is that they're simply going to die off because it'll get cold well before they actually will move on. So I'm using our little discussion here about their life cycle to kind of demonstrate the timing of when they arrive here and what you're going to see. So if we start at June, adults are really going to arrive here early to mid-June, and they're going to lay their eggs. Those eggs will take about 2 weeks to hatch, and we're going to get our first larvae in late June, early July. They're going to start consuming whatever they can, and eventually they're going to hit their pupation in August after anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks, depending on temperature. These are going to be very sensitive to how warm it is. The warmer it is, the faster they will develop. Once they get to that August pupation. They're going to stay in their chrysalis for about 2.5 weeks, and then they're going to hatch out into the new set of adults in September. Those adults may or may not survive. If infestations are heavy and conditions remain right, we could get a third, possibly even a fourth generation. However, that really depends on how long the summer lasts. Are the conditions going to stay warm enough, or are we going to have an earlier cold period come on? Right now, I don't think that the current cold front's actually going to last. I think it's supposed to warm up for this weekend. So I'm more inclined to say we probably aren't done with them yet. But I'm sure that a lot of our entomologists in the entomology department are going to have a good answer for that pretty soon. So let's go over a few of their feeding behaviors. Now, Spodoptera frugiperta is very capable of feeding on a lot of different species of plants. They will typically prefer grass species. Now, that being said, I mentioned that I did graduate research on these insects. I was finding them on soybeans back in 2010. So I know that they can occur on a lot of different plants that do have leaf tissue that aren't necessarily grasses. Here in Indiana, we're probably going to find them more on corn and alfalfa. And I'm going to lean more towards the alfalfa environment because that's what I've already been seeing so far this year. They're going to be active during cooler periods of the day, which means they're going to go for the early morning and then kind of into the afternoon hours as the light begins to adjust downwards, and they're not just going to kind of burn up wherever they sit and feed. If they're not out, what they're doing is they're hiding under plant debris at the ground level during those really intense daylight hours. That way they can stay cool without being in direct sunlight, and they can hide from predators because these things will look great to birds. They're going to be a great food source for them. Now, during the height of larval populations, these guys can very, very easily decimate any grass species that they're currently interested in. And as far as I'm aware, they're really only going to the only grass species they're not going to consume is Bermuda grass. Everything else is fair game. They're going to migrate across their food sources in really large numbers. So you're basically just going to see this expanding wave of brown grass if they're hitting a yard, or you're going to see the same thing maybe in an alfalfa field as they tear apart the leaf tissue, but leave the really hard woody stems behind that they don't want to eat. So the damage is going to start really slow. You're going to maybe see some browning of grass tips. It may look like they're kind of getting papery like tissue. And then all of a sudden overnight, your yard's just going to disappear. I know it sounds a little glib, but it is very true. You're going to come out and the next morning, your yard's just going to be brown part of the way across it. That's a really good sign that these guys are feeding. They're going to take the leaf tissue of any normal grasses, and they're going to take it right down to the ground. If they're working with something that isn't a grass, they're going to strip off all the leaf tissue and leave the stems behind. And I have a couple of pictures that I'm going to show you that'll demonstrate that here. So this is a great turf grass example of what they can do. You can see the edge of that wave right towards the center of the picture there. That is where the larvae are. They are eating their way in that green grass. That's where the food is. All the brown stuff, they've already been there. They've already moved on. They've done their damage. So you're not going to find anything right there. You want to look at where the edge of that green is, and that's where you're going to locate these guys in turf grass. However, if we go to our alfalfa field, you can see that they are just destroying all of that leaf tissue. And that's what you're going to use if you're looking at that kind of broadleaf situation. Now, one thing I wanted to do is you probably can immediately see the two fall armyworm right there at the front of the picture, but I'm going to highlight all of the other ones. I spent some time trying to look for all of the different fall armyworm that are in this picture. So I was able to locate all of these guys. So that's a total of about, I think, 6 or 7 of them. So they're going to vary in size a little bit depending on how easily they've been able to get to different foods and consume them, but they will stay fairly close to each other in size. But the trouble is even at large sizes, they can be really hard to see, even in this situation. That mottled color that they have serves very, very well to keep them hidden from predators and from anybody who might want to get rid of them from their plants, unfortunately. So keep that in mind as you begin to search for them. You've got to kind of adjust how your eyes are going to work a little bit to look for them. Now, I already mentioned a little bit of this. In a typical year, you're going to expect about 2 generations. And in a typical year, honestly, you may not see them at all. This year, we have a pretty heavy infestation, which is why we've gotten so many more reports. It's probably why you were interested in this program this evening. The trouble is that at least in turf grass, by the time you notice there's a problem, the damage is already done. When half your yard's gone, the insects are moving through there. You can make applications to try to get rid of them. But I'm going to explain this a little more later. There may not really be any good cause to take that action. Now, in some years, we may see as many as 4 generations. I'm kind of wondering if we're going to hit a third one here or not, or if we're going to get some reports soon about it already occurring. What you need to do is you need to determine if there are still larvae feeding. And there are a few different ways you can do this. You can actually just get down on your hands and knees and look, or you can check for birds. Birds are going to be coming after these larvae as they feed, and check to see if you can find birds at the edges of where that green grass meets the brown grass. That'll be a great indicator to let you know that, hey, these birds are finding something to eat right here, and most likely it's Fall Armyworm. All right, so getting started with how are you going to manage these things? I've told you all the terrible things about them, so let's give you some solutions to work with. This is something that I tell farmers all the time, and I'm probably going to do it till the day I die. Your first step in handling this insect and hopefully any other you encounter is you need to do scouting. You need to know what you're dealing with before you decide to take action, because otherwise you're going to be wasting your time and your money. So how do we scout for Spodoptera frugiperta? Well, I've already told you a little bit. The fall armyworm is going to feed at the edge of the damaged area. Don't search in the area that's already been damaged. They've moved on. They've already got that food out of there. They're going on to the next area. You want to look in the green tissue at the edges. The feeding is going to be most active in the early morning and the late afternoon, like I said earlier. So those are going to be your optimal times to check. Check for the bird feeding right at those times. You may not even need to leave your house if it's in your yard. You can look out your front window and see if there are birds at the edge. And if there are, you know that they're present. If you can't scout then and you have to do it during like midday hours, what you need to do is to check for larvae within the thatch layer. And that's going to be that layer of plant debris that's adjacent to the ground. You can use a soap and water wash to kind of flush them out of the area. And there are a few different suggestions on how to formulate it. I don't like recommending it because I don't like the idea of putting soap on the soil, which could change your soil profile, but this is a way that you can get these guys to come out. If you use a lightly soapy mixture and pour it onto the ground right there, the larvae will begin to move because they want to escape the soap, which is dangerous to them, and you'll be able to see them come out. And the water will also just kind of wash them along, so you may see them get carried along with it. And that's one way that you can actually check for their presence if it's during this period of time. The other thing that I like to suggest is to check for their egg masses. This is actually how I got my message earlier today about kale. A friend of mine sent me a picture asking, what's this bunch of eggs on her kale in her garden? And I looked at it and it took me all of 3 seconds to go, that's an egg mass from fall armyworm, which means she probably needs to check all of her kale and every other plant around there, unfortunately. So if we're talking about in agriculture, when you're doing your scouting, you're checking for egg masses at the right time to help you make decisions in control. Now, this is also going to matter if you're doing like garden efforts or if you manage turf grass. Though in turf grass, it's probably going to be a little bit more challenging. You want to check for the egg masses on the undersides of the leaves. The adult moth is going to put those there to help them avoid sunlight and to keep them out of the eyes of predators. They might be covered in silk, which is that fuzzy appearance. These larvae will produce silk as they grow. and the eggs are going to be very tightly grouped together. Now, when they hatch, the larvae are going to feed on the immediate area, and they're going to be very, very tiny. You will barely be able to see these with the naked eye, but they will be present. And what they're going to do is they're going to feed on that immediate area and kind of create the window pane effect. So if you've ever dealt with rose slug sawfly or any other slugs or other slug species, the rose slug sawfly is an insect species, you're going to know what that window pane looks like. Basically, something is fed on the leaf tissue so much, but it's left one very, very thin layer of tissue that they just didn't want to digest that you can almost see through. That's the window pane effect. Now for scouting, if you're doing this in agriculture, and I'm hoping I got a few farmers in my audience right now, the basic level of scouting, if we're not talking about any particular species, is randomly sample 20 to 25 plants within a field. Count the number of live larvae on each plant. And if all of those plants together have about 75% infestation or 75% damage done to plants, and you find larvae that are less than 1 1/4 inch, you're going to have an economic impact to your yield. Now, if you're a gardener, you can probably overlay this onto your own garden. Check a certain number of plants, like say a third of the plants that you had planted. Count the number of larvae. If you're seeing damage, like if over 75% of your plants are damaged, or if you see over 2 to 3 insects on too many plants, you probably need to take some kind of action to protect your produce. Now, once you're done with scouting, you have another step you can do. And that's going to be most likely a chemical application. Now, not everybody's going to do this. Farmers are going to have to if they're going to try to help their crops survive. And there are a lot of options. Most likely in garden situations, you're going to rely on something like Sevin. And that's probably going to be fairly stable. Sprayable BT spray is another option that you can do. It should have some effect on these larvae, though they are a little bit resistant to it sometimes with different genes. And there are some other ones like synthetic pyrethroids that can also give you a benefit. But if you're looking at a turf grass environment, the benefit of chemical control might not outweigh the cost, because by the time you see the damage is already done. And you may not be able to act fast enough to really stop them from doing more. The good thing is that if these guys consume your entire yard right to the ground, it's going to grow back. Next year, they'll just come right back up. You're not going to be able to save stuff this year, really, at least not without some damage. So usually I would recommend don't bother with the chemical control in your yard. Now, if you want to, there are different products that are labeled, though they might not be specifically labeled for fall armyworm. They're more going to be labeled for general caterpillar control. And that's most likely what you're going to end up applying. It's probably going to be something like Sevin or something else, a carbaryl or synthetic pyrethroid. But again, I'm just not sure there's really any benefit to doing that. Now, if you're in an agricultural environment, I sincerely hope you scouted, man, because if you don't, you're about to burn a bunch of your money. You need that scouting to make a control decision. If you don't, you could waste resources, you could mistime your application based on larval development, or you could potentially over or under apply and end up doing more damage to yourself. Now, there are a lot of products available that will treat these insects. Warrior 2 and Ambush are just a couple of examples. There's actually a publication, and you're looking at part of it right now, that will go through all of the different things that are currently on the market to be able to treat these. I myself have applied lambda-cyhalothrin to these insects to control them. And all of these things, these are nasty, nasty chemicals. They will hurt you, so you have to be very careful. You need to follow that label. If you don't know how to apply this stuff yourself, you need to hire someone to do so, because most of the things on this list will be restricted use. You will need an operator license to be able to apply them. And I've made several applications on fields as a researcher, and I do not like applying this stuff. One thing that I will say here is that Some of these chemicals are not going to be on the market much longer. For example, chlorpyrifos most likely is going to disappear, and you're going to find that under the label Lorsban. So I would kind of just drop that off any of your planning from now on if you've used chlorpyrifos in the past. Most likely, you're going to be using something like bifenthrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, or permethrin. Spinosad is a biorational pesticide, which you can use in agriculture, in gardens, and in a lot of situations. But there are, like I said, several options. If you don't know how to do this yourself and you're working in agriculture, I would really talk to your co-op, talk to your local extension educator to help you make decisions on what to use. All right, so let's talk a little bit about management and a couple of agricultural species. So if we're looking at corn, now the scouting here is a little bit more specific. Now, what you're going to do here is you need to start thinking about your control plan when you have egg masses covering 5% of the plants, or over 25% of the plants are damaged and have live larvae. So that's a pretty low bar there. That's a low threshold for taking action. That means that you need to be on top of your scouting, and you've got to be checking as soon as early June gets there. You got to start looking for those egg masses, and you got to start checking for any larval damage. Because if you leave it too long, these larvae have a tendency to move down into the whorl of the corn, and then their frass, their excrement, is going to actually plug up the whorl, so that way the pesticide won't actually reach them. It helps protect the larvae from other insects and predators, and it's going to make it so that it's pretty much impossible to properly spray for them. This is why treatment timing is so important. Now, this also counts for those of you who like to grow sweet corn. The larvae are going to act the same way. So if you have been dealing with them, keep an eye on this from year to year. The next time we look like we have a prediction for a drought year, start doing this habit so that way you can check for these insects, you check for their egg masses, and get a jump on it early. Now, in sweet corn, I'm not going to suggest a pesticide. I think that may be overdoing it a little bit, because I feel like you could probably manually remove egg masses yourself if you're on top of this. Most sweet corn plantings really aren't that large. And of course, you could use a synthetic pyrethroid that you get from your local garden store or farm store to help you treat these if you actually want to do that in your sweet corn. Oh, I've made a mistake there. It's supposed to say management and alfalfa. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I got, like I said earlier, a lot of reports of these insects in alfalfa, and I at least wanted to cover this evening before I let you guys go. So in alfalfa, the damage is going to appear very rapidly, and it's going to be one of those, it's going to look like it happened overnight situations. You're going to go to bed one day and then come out, your field's just going to be shredded. I actually had a gentleman visit my office about a week ago now who brought in several of these insects and told me his story. His field was just annihilated. He had about 5 acres of alfalfa, and they were just destroyed overnight. And he showed me the insects, and of course they were late instar Fall Armyworm. He kind of knew that already. He was just wanting me to confirm it, and sure enough, they were. But this kind of highlights to me the importance of maintaining your scouting efforts. The economic threshold in alfalfa and most other grass species you might be growing is 3 or more live larvae within a single square foot. So that is a very, very low bar to take action. That means that, again, just like in corn, you've got to be on top of that. You've got to be constantly looking. One method you could use is one that's commonly taught by Purdue Extension. Go get yourself a hula hoop. Throw it in the middle of your field and check every plant in that hula hoop. If you see more than 3 or 4 live larvae, you have got to be thinking about what actions you're going to take there, because you're going to have a problem if that keeps growing. Now, I'm not going to go over pesticides again here, because corn and alfalfa are going to use some pretty similar pesticides. And you will always follow the label for its use. Please follow that label. That is intended for your safety, for the safety of other animals that are going to be helping you do your job growing your plants. This counts whether you're using it in a garden or if you're using it in corn. And of course, the label is the law. All right, that's all I had for you guys this evening. Thanks for hanging out with me. I've got my contact information right there, both of my offices. Please feel free to call or email me at any time. I also have the link to the Purdue Ed Store there, where you can find a lot of publications on fall armyworm and other insect species, as well as a link to our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab, which can help identify disease issues in plants very, very quickly. And I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.